Good afternoon. Once again, I would like to thank Reverend David Jarrett, the ministerial staff and the trustees, and also the steward board, and all the other members of Bethel AME Church for allowing me the opportunity to speak to you all this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I am Peter Boykin. I am a history instructor at Wayne County Community College District. I have been teaching there now for 14 years. I was made full-time last year. This is my first year anniversary being full-time, so it's definitely a blessing. And I appreciate all of you coming out today in this inclement weather for a very important subject. We're talking about Black History Month, and today's topic will be Reconstruction. Before I get into this, I just want to let you all know that Reconstruction is a very important topic to me. It's one of my favorite areas of African American history, or American history, to lecture on. It shows a pivotal transition in this country from slavery to the mainstream. So that's what I will be discussing with you this afternoon, is how Reconstruction helped African Americans pretty much over the last 150 plus years, because it wasn't that long ago. If you think about it, Reconstruction started in 1865, and this is 2018, so if you do the math, it's just a little over 150 years. This is a quote, and it says that Reconstruction is the vast labor movement of ignorant, muddled, and bewildered white men who had been disinherited of land and labor and fought a long battle of sheer subsistence, hanging on the edge of poverty, eating clay and chasing slaves, and now lurching up to manhood. Does anyone know who made this quote or very profound statement?
Douglas?
Nope. It was made by Dr. W.B. Du Bois. You were close with Frederick Douglass. Yes, it was a man of prominence, a man who leads the vision for African Americans to transition into this new way of life. Why was Reconstruction necessary? Well, as I had just alluded to earlier in opening up, it helped the U.S. government incorporate African Americans into the mainstream society. So now that African Americans were free, they were American citizens. And you had new constitutional amendments that came in with the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment. Those amendments dealt with citizenship, ending slavery, and also the right to vote. And it sought to unite the North and South, because we had two separate nations existing during slavery. The South ceded in 1861 with the Confederate States of America, the CSA. So they had no government, they had no army, all on the same continent. The North, which was the Union, they had those sentiments too, but they were a little bit more progressive. But economically, the South was more reliant on servitude. In the North, they had industries and believed in education. You had universities in the South, but not as many prevalent universities as you had in the North. Which segues into my next topic, which is education. So this is the most significant accomplishment of Reconstruction. As you know, during slavery, African Americans weren't allowed to be literate. They couldn't read or write. The ones that did had to do it in secrecy, or they had covert situations, but now, with laws to protect them in Reconstruction, they're able to finally get K-12 education, as well as go to college. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up so that African Americans could matriculate at major universities, primarily historically black colleges. And one of them was one of my alma maters, Howard University in Washington, D.C., which was set up by Oliver Otis Howard. To add as an addendum to this, my father and I's alma mater, Hampton University, was set up by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong. And he was a part of the American Missionary Association, so they kind of coalesced with the Freedmen's Bureau, even though they were private. They had the same mission in trying to make sure that African Americans had access to higher education. The great thing about Howard is that it was the premier, and still is the premier HBCU, because they have a law school, And undergraduate programs include medicine for African Americans to attend, because during this period in time, African Americans couldn't go to the University of South Carolina. They had to go to South Carolina State University, which is where my family, the Whitaker family is connected. They had to go to Grambling State. They had to go to FAMU, okay? Or the private HBCUs like Hampton, like Wilberforce, okay? And also Fisk. So you had 5 more institutions that were started. By 1870, 4,000 schools were staffed by 9,000 teachers. Most were African American, especially in the South. So this was awesome that for the first time, African American students were educated by their own. Yes, they had some white teachers, but they found it imperative to have African American teachers, educating young people to instill in them pride as they were transitioning, being enculturated into mainstream society. By 1876, African Americans and whites were matriculating in segregated schools. So most of the schools that had African American students were small. They were in rural areas. They didn't have the most adequate supplies and books. Students had to walk hundreds of miles to school. So if even there was a family in a town, they maybe had to walk 100, 200 miles to school because there were not adequate facilities for African Americans. Also, as a sidebar, African Americans were buried in separate cemeteries too. So I just alluded to the AMA was working in concert with the Freedmen's Bureau and other organizations. You have the AME Church, which is where we are at today. They established Wilberforce. They established Payne College. They established a lot of HBCUs. Okay, so even black denominations like the Black Baptist Church established HBCUs too. So the church played a very pivotal role in higher education. Politics, okay, you first have the 15th Amendment that gave African Americans the right to vote and to vote in national, state, and local elections. Blanche K. Bruce and Hiram Revels were U.S. senators elected from Mississippi. So for the first time, African Americans were able to gain political power. PBS Pinchback was the first African American governor of Louisiana, who was elevated from lieutenant governor. Okay, so he was pretty much the antecedent to Douglas Wilder. He was the first African American elected governor in 1989. So PBS Pinchback pretty much paved the way. There were 6 African Americans in the House of Representatives during Reconstruction. You had Benjamin Turner from Alabama, Robert E. Large from South Carolina, Josiah Walker from Florida, Jefferson Long from Georgia, and Joseph Rainey from South Carolina. In addition to African Americans on the national level, you had a lot on the local level too. You had state senators, state representatives, county clerks. Okay, so African Americans were not able to be engaged in the political process and help make very pivotal decisions for the community. And I forgot Robert Elliott from South Carolina too. He was the 6th one. African Americans were even justices of the peace too. Okay, in some places, and there were some African American lawmen too. The Freedmen's Bank, so now finance was a major staple in the African American community thanks to the Freedmen's Bureau. Reverend John W. Alfred and A.M. Sperry, an abolitionist, launched the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company to eliminate individual bank mismanagement and bring all African American accounts under the auspices of a central institution. So for the first time, African Americans could have their money managed in a bank. It was incorporated on March 3rd, 1865 through the United States Congress. Its headquarters was in Washington, D.C., with 37 branches in 13 states. And most of these branches were in southern states. "7% interest was allowed for deposits." It was a lot for that day because the economy was totally different. Unclaimed accounts were pooled into charitable funds that were used as an act of benevolence. So to help African American school children. So they believed that, they should finance public education, even when there was opposition. In 1870, African Americans were the majority in the operations of all local branches. So now we didn't have to rely on the government to take care of us. We were now in the position of power to manage our money. Unfortunately, there was mismanagement that occurred in the 4 years, and Frederick Douglass, we mentioned his name earlier, tried to resurrect the bank and overcome mismanagement issues. And we still see that today, with a lot of major institutions. He even donated his own personal money. That's how committed and dedicated he was to ensure that African Americans were in control of their financial destiny. He put his own money up to save the bank. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and the bank closed with $2.9 million that's owed to 61,144 depositors. So $2.9 million is a lot of money for back then. That would probably be the equivalent, today to making, 20 million, all right? So here at we have the mantra of what's happened in American freedom with 40 acres and a mule. So General William Tecumseh Sherman, the general from the Civil War, granted allotments of 40 acres and a mule, and this was land seized from the Confederates. Under Special Field Order 15, African Americans were bestowed land off the Sea Islands of Georgia and the islands of South Carolina. So African Americans went from working on the land to owning the land. The Union Army also donated land to free African Americans as well. So they would give them land, namely the old plantations. By 1870, 30,000 African Americans owned land in the South. Sharecropping was a system that was created in which African Americans would rent the land and take small plots and get a small portion of the owners the land by the end of the year. So even though it was viewed as progress, it was really, if you look at it in hindsight, an extension of slavery. It was a lot of African Americans who pretty much went into debt. And the confluence of the South's agricultural system was a disaster. And the white landowners, as I said a few minutes ago, forced African Americans into poverty, and it wasn't smart, and they had people problems, and it was just a bad experiment. So during Reconstruction, there was a lot of antagonism going around. Democrats were against integration. They were basically against African Americans being included in the system. So some emergence of domestic terrorism organizations. Today we talk about, you have all these terrorist groups from overseas, but this country has always been embedded in terrorism. Ku Klux Klan, and also the White League, were terrorist organizations. These were men that were educated. They were lawyers, judges, doctors. They would put on white sheets to hide and mask their identity so that they would be covert in engaging in terrorist activities, but everyone knew that they were powerful men because their identities were well known in their communities. So they would flog African Americans from voting. They would rape women. It was just horrendous how they antagonized African Americans from being a part of the process. Whites from the North faced discrimination too. They were called carpetbaggers as they saw their presence in the South in order to see the success of the Reconstruction initiative. So they were intimidated as well, along with the African Americans that they were helping. And this was done so, rapidly that a lot of whites in the North backed off because they were intimidated. They wanted to hang in there and try to help African Americans succeed. So the federal government tried to pass laws, like the Civil Rights Act of 1870, the Enforcement Act. It was passed by protecting African Americans in dealing with white domestic terrorist organizations. And to reduce violence, and so really it was just a piece of paper, because the violence still occurred. In Memphis and New Orleans, there were riots. Ida B. Wells, she left Memphis because there were a lot of lynchings. Lynchings were very prevalent around this period of time, too. So this is, in essence, a prelude to the next section, which is the demise of Reconstruction. So, in 1873, there was an economic depression. That really didn't help things at all. And this was in the North. And now the Northerners were starting to see the Southern cause as a non-factor. And so now they want to focus more on the economics in the North than the South. So this is when we see the backing off of the North from Reconstruction. By 1880, the Democrats had taken control of the South state legislatures, and of course the transition to Capitol Hill, with the Democrats taking control of the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. There were several U.S. Supreme Court cases that were decided around this time that dealt with civil rights. The first was U.S. versus Cruikshank, 1875. They stated that only states could persecute individuals and prosecute individuals under the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. So now, federal government said, okay, the states, you are responsible for dealing with civil rights and criminal activities. Federal government saying laissez-faire, hands off. Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican president, but 7 Democrats estimated promises made by his predecessor, Ulysses S. Grant, who's considered to be the father of Reconstruction. So even the White House was changing too. Poll taxes, grandfather clauses, and intimidating tactics were used to disenfranchise African Americans from voting in southern states. So now they were taxing African Americans to vote. They said you have to own property to vote. You have to pay to vote. And this is a constitutional right, which means it should have been free. Okay? The grandfather clause, they had to trace back your genes. You know, you're an American citizen. You were several generations back, you couldn't even vote. And also, they made people read the state constitution, African Americans. If they couldn't interpret the state constitution, they couldn't vote. And they knew not all African Americans were literate. So this was definitely a malicious tactic that was concocted by those who wanted to suppress the black vote. So now we move into Jim Crow. So you know Jim Crow is the name of a character. Jim Crow was the name of a minstrel character that was portrayed by whites. They would use cork or shoe polish to make themselves appear as African Americans. The first case that set a precedence for Jim Crow was Plessy versus Ferguson. The case involved Homer Plessy. Homer Plessy was a Creole from New Orleans. He was trying to ride a streetcar, and it said he was African American. He went to court, the state court, and then on to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal was the law of the land in creating public accommodations for public transportation in the United States. So from this point onward, African Americans were traveling south. They had to ride in a separate railroad car. Most often, it wasn't the most comfortable car because they had no air conditioning, barely any heat, very hard seats. The bathrooms, they had to go to separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Movie theaters, this includes, public places now. Movie theaters, African Americans had to sit in the balcony. Okay? Another case that was decided some 13 years or so later, Cumming versus, this was 7 years before 1899. Cumming versus Richmond County Board of Education dealing with schools. They moved that taxpayers should support schools for whites only, and that was legal. So they said they were under no obligation to use their tax dollars for African Americans. We still see that today. I'll conclude this presentation talking about post-Brown versus Board of Education. So now segregation is legal, which is de jure, or by law. De facto segregation was primarily in the North, and it was illegal. Richmond, California, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area. The area grew exponentially in population prior to and during the years preceding World War II. Oil refineries, shipbuilding, and the Ford Motor Company were an economic stimulus to the town's revenue. While social activities were integrated, housing was segregated. The federal government financed white residents to abandon temporary housing or apartments for the Rollingwood community, which were newer constructed homes. So there was de facto segregation occurring in terms of housing patterns, but social activities were in fact integrated. This is California, ladies and gentlemen, and this segregation was illegal. The white residents got better homes, while African Americans basically got, for lack of a better term, scraps or leftovers in terms of housing. So within 2 decades, Richmond became predominantly African American, and as a side note, I have family members who live out there. They moved out there during this Great Migration. So again, you had several Great Migration. You had one in the mid-20th century, then you had the one in the 1940s to Detroit. You had one out west. So my family, mom's side, is from Louisiana. So they went out to California during this period of time for opportunities out there. And I have family in Richmond. They were living out there when all this was going on, okay? And the same thing was done to Mexicans too, so it wasn't just African Americans. So they faced the same type of segregation in San Francisco and Los Angeles, all up and down the California coast. So after the war, the industrial base in Richmond would decline. And as a result of that, there weren't any jobs there. Kind of a precursor of what is happening in Detroit today. Other major industrial bases, because Detroit was called the Arsenal of Democracy. And that would be the same for Richmond back then. Half the industries that were in Richmond moved to other parts of the country, the world. But Richmond saw a lot of poverty. So another community that's above Richmond called Vallejo, and they had industries too. So what happened was these industries moved out of Richmond and Vallejo, and they moved further out, going to California, the mountains east of Oakland, say they moved to Sacramento, some to Southern California and other parts of the state. Silicon Valley, okay, they became wealthy off some of these industries, but they left behind people in areas like Richmond. So now we hit home with Detroit. We had immigrants coming in from the American South, as well as immigrants from the South who were white. So there was a mass influx of a multiracial immigration wave. Ford's Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan had no provisions for the African American workers to reside near the factory, which was similar to Dearborn, Ford's main base. The Federal Works Administration proposed the Sojourner Truth homes in Northeast Detroit for African American residents. Mayor Orville Hubbard did not want African Americans living in Dearborn, therefore Inkster was for the African American workers. Okay, so now we have to deal with the Ford workers in Ypsilanti. So they try to keep the African American workers in the city. So African American workers had to drive 45 miles from the city of Detroit out to Ypsilanti. Back then, the speed limit wasn't that high. You could probably only go maybe about 45, 50 miles on Interstate 94. Today, you can travel out to Ypsilanti in the western suburbs going 70 miles per hour and get out there much more expeditiously. The Federal Works Administration was one of the pet projects of the New Deal program created by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So they constructed the Sojourner Truth Homes in Northeast Detroit for African American residents. That's actually not too far from here. It's over in near Conant Gardens area. Okay, but there was a problem with that. Back then, you only had pockets of African Americans who resided on the east side of Detroit. Congressman Rudolph Tenowokowitz wanted the units assigned only to white tenants for fear of declining property values that could exacerbate with the development's presence. Okay, so they were looking at all these devious ways, to undercut aid for African Americans. Once again, this is still similar to what they did during Reconstruction, basically trying to rob Peter to pay Paul. So despite the fears of integration, the Truth Homes did in fact allow African American tenants to move in. The Detroit Housing Commission eventually supported other government-subsidized housing developments for African Americans with whites living on the perimeter of them. So whites pretty much did not want to integrate with blacks, and they would eventually spread to other areas of the city. Down the street here, we have the Brewster products, okay? We have products off the Lodge Freeway, the Jeffries, and then you had the products off of Joy Road and Southfield, okay? And now that is an example of that area used to be white on Southfield and Joy Road. Products became predominantly African American, but then you had whites living on the perimeter. So it's all that. Once again, this is Detroit. Detroit had de facto illegal segregation. With housing patterns, I'll even take it a step further. Look at the deeds to homes in Palmer Woods, in Sherwood Forest, the Groves Points. They say don't sell to blacks, don't sell to Jews, okay, don't sell to certain ethnic groups, okay, so African Americans could only go to, for a certain period of time, Boston to Edison. They couldn't go out to Palmer Woods or any of the Groves Points. In the late 60s or 70s, or until after the Detroit riots, when white flight was becoming pervasive. So next, we deal with school segregation. Most of the public schools in the United States, mainly in the South, were segregated by law after Reconstruction's demise. In states like California, where there was no legislation on segregation, Mexicans were classified as white. Illegal accommodations were made to put them in segregated schools. Case in point, Mendez versus Westminster. And for those of you who are familiar with the Los Angeles area or not familiar with the Los Angeles area, Westminster is a section that is pretty much on the perimeter of the Los Angeles International Airport. And at that time, it was designated as an area that Latinos could live in, but they could not integrate with white students in the same community. Although it was forbidden, Indiana had segregated schools for African American children up until the 1960s. So in major cities like Gary, Indianapolis, you had black schools. Basically, Brown versus Board of Education struck down segregation in Indiana. And this was, in fact, a de facto practice similar to what was exacerbated in California. So, after World War II, you see affirmative action come about. Executive Order 8802, it prohibited discrimination in the defense industry. It was the first federal action to provide equal opportunity in the United States. So the Army, Navy, all of the war defense industries and military units saw African Americans finally being hired. Then, finally, with Executive Order 9981, African Americans were able to be integrated in combat units. And this took effect with the Korean War. So during World War II, units were still segregated, especially with the Tuskegee Airmen. Then you had Executive Order 11246. This prohibited discrimination in hiring practices with respect to government contractors. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission became a new federal government agency in 1965 under Lyndon Johnson's administration, and it oversaw that private and public sector employers in the United States complied with federal government mandates that protected employee rights on the basis of race, gender, age, religion, and sexual orientation. More African American mayors were being elected. African Americans were able to get those government contracts for jobs. So now African Americans were able to be in the room with government officials and big business and have access to lucrative contracts from, custodial services to landscaping, things of that nature. The Equal Opportunity Commission was the new federal government agency that was created in 1965 under the auspices of President Lyndon Johnson to oversee that private and public sector employers in the United States compiled with federal government mandates that protected employee rights on the basis of race, gender, age, religion, and sexual orientation. So now this was a mandate to employers saying that you have to hire more women, you have to hire more African Americans or people of color. And if you didn't comply by this, then you would face legal action or some type of reprimand. This legislation was definitely needed because you had a lot of employers that maybe only had one African American or one woman working, or they were only working in a lower grade capacity of occupation, such as a janitor or secretary. And of course, most of the whites who were working there, 9 times out of 10, weren't always the most qualified. When you apply for jobs, you had a little box on forms to check if you were an African American male. You need this information for statistical purposes. They want to know how many African Americans were hired, how many women were hired, did we hire enough? So this data is imperative with respect to the growth of an organization. In the post-affirmative action civil rights movement, you had major cities in the United States that for the first time elected an African American mayor. Cleveland, Ohio had Carl Stokes, and Gary, Indiana, which many say holds the title with the first African American mayor, had elected Richard Hatcher. And then in 1973, you had Coleman Young become the first African American mayor of Detroit. In Atlanta, you had Maynard Jackson, and he was a definite giant because Maynard Jackson, as you have noticed, was responsible for Atlanta constructing the world's largest airport. Many of you have probably been to Atlanta, changed planes there. All that was because of an African American man who demanded that African Americans have contracts. If you watch Eyes on the Prize, Keys to the Kingdom talks about this. Maynard Jackson did not want that airport built unless he had at least about 40% minority participation. And he said that to the city's white power broker: if you do not have African Americans, okay, then the majority of the airport will not be built. So of course, as you can imagine, there was some remorse, there was some antagonism going on, but they were finally able to get in the room and compromise, and the world's largest airport has been built. And Atlanta just selected, I think, their second female mayor, and they have had African American leadership there now for 46 years. State universities. So now in the South, African Americans could go to University of Maryland. They could matriculate at University of Virginia and other state schools that once had closed the doors to them due to Jim Crow laws. With respect to politics, African Americans are gaining ground in the U.S. House of Representatives. And even for the first time since Reconstruction, you saw the election of African American U.S. House of Representative members in the South. Edward Brooke, he was from Massachusetts and a Republican. Okay, my grandfather, boykinpe, had the opportunity to meet him when he was in office. He was very progressive. You have to remember that during this period of time, Republicans, they were different. They were progressive. They were more for civil rights. Going back to Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation. And then you had Carol Moseley Braun, the first Democratic U.S. Senator elected. And then in the 21st century, you had Barack Obama, who was a state senator in Illinois, and he rose to the occasion by being the first African-American U.S. Senator elected in the 21st century. And it's ironic that both U.S. Senators that were from Chicago were both African-American, and they definitely set a precedence for us to emulate. Of course, you know, here in Detroit, we broke ground with the U.S. House of Representatives. We had Diggs. Okay, also, you had, of course, John Conyers. And you had many others that have been elected to this coveted position in history. It's very important that you know the historical foundation with respect to African Americans on Capitol Hill. Oh, and I forgot to mention that George Crockett was a U.S. congressman, and he came right after Diggs was elected. Charles Diggs was elected to Congress. And the last bullet point on this slide, many African Americans have ascended into corporate America and the federal government, along with state and municipal entities. Reginald Lewis, okay, he became the CEO of Beatrice Food in the 80s. By the way, he and my father went to Harvard Law School together. He became one of the richest African American men in the country, very progressive man. And if you haven't read his book, get his book, Why Should White Guys Have All the Fun by Reginald Lewis. So we elected the first African American president. It was 10 years ago. It's hard to believe that it was 10 years ago we elected Barack Obama president, and this was all made possible through grassroots efforts in order to solidify his victory in 2008 and 2012. So after he was first elected in 2008, many strong efforts were made to try to disenfranchise voters by the 2012 election, fearing that he would win re-election that year. So we're seeing the same tactics from Reconstruction resurface. You know, people were trying to say that this is a post-racial society. No, unfortunately, we weren't. And we still aren't even today. Republicans in Pennsylvania, this is what they did. So Republicans in Pennsylvania and other states tried to enact stringent voter ID laws as a hindrance to prevent African Americans from voting. In Michigan, with the housing crisis, you had voters disenfranchised by the Secretary of State because they really had no permanent place of residence to justify that they were able to vote. To the south of here in Ohio, in Hamilton County and the Cincinnati suburbs, try to reduce the voting hours for the African American voting districts, but they would let the suburban districts vote until 8 o'clock. So they said that the African American voters could only vote until 7 o'clock, and that was therefore malicious. Florida, which, as you all well know, had improprieties go on in the 2000 presidential election, tried to send out mass mailings to neighborhoods of color, and they were to extrapolate who wasn't valid to vote based upon the return to sender responses. So you know the trickery was still existing, and the people were doing everything humanly possible to make sure that Barack Obama wouldn't serve for a full 8 years in office, but they failed. A new Reconstruction. I devised this slide on the basis of Reverend Dr. William J. Barber's book, A Third Reconstruction. What we are witnessing now is that African American political leadership is on the decline in many trailblazing cities that broke ground, like Detroit, Memphis, and Chicago. In these cities, we now have white mayors. African American voters have developed apathy due to cronyism and nepotism, coupled in with a lot of political corruption. African American voters have lost hope in their elected officials. Many mayors, like Kwame Kilpatrick here in Detroit, have been imprisoned due to political malfeasance, and also, we're seeing that a lot of citizens just do not see the importance of voting anymore, and they just do not view politicians as individuals who represent their best interests at heart. Gentrification is pushing lifelong residents out of America's urban core. We see it when we walk right outside this church. Walk right outside this church and see gentrification going on in this area. Okay, in cities like Washington, D.C., I used to live there. I don't even recognize it anymore because we used to call it Chocolate City. Now African Americans are being pushed out to Maryland and Virginia. Taxes are going up. Housing prices are going up, especially your housing prices. Okay, so they're bringing in young white professionals. So our seniors who have been in these cities for generations are now being pushed out and can't afford living there because of high taxes and high rents or mortgages. So even Harlem, which was a mainstay of African Americans, has been gentrified, and now young professional whites are coming in. And a lot of these young people who come in cities don't have the best interests at heart of the indigenous people because they don't even know the history behind communities like Harlem or U Street in Washington, D.C., which was another major black enclave that pretty much was similar to Black Bottom here in Detroit. Public schools are now being plagued with violence due to inadequate infrastructure, declining enrollment, and a lack of African American teachers. Case in point, when I was living in Washington, D.C., I used to volunteer at a public school at my fraternity. On Saturdays, we had Saturday school in Alexandria, Virginia. Average income in Alexandria is probably maybe about $200,000 a year to $500,000. And Alexandria's public school system is mostly African American. But now it's probably priced out most of the African Americans there. And a lot of school systems started changing the dynamics. So when the white parents see that the kids are not going, we don't have to pass this bill. We don't have to go with blacks, let's just go to private schools. Okay, like I said, violence and enrollments are down. People are losing faith in public schools because of corruption. So now, with all of the negative influences in public schools, people do not see the need to support them. Instead, we're seeing students enroll at charter schools. Some are even homeschooling children because they feel that these environments will be more conducive to their matriculation or success. The first thing that families look at when moving into a new community is the quality of the public school system. If they see that the public school systems are not up to par, then they will look at the alternatives that are available to them. So here in Detroit, demographic studies have been done to show that many of the new families moving into Detroit, or new couples rather, do not have kids, and once they do have children, they will most likely 9 times out of 10 move out to Oakland County or Washtenaw or some of the suburban enclaves here in Detroit for a quality education for their kids. Unemployment. Unemployment is a major crisis. The African in the American urban core. African American employment is extremely high due to lack of education and the availability of jobs. If you drive about 5 minutes from here to the old Packard plant, we see that a lot of older buildings are decaying. The proliferation of jobs that we had when Detroit was the arsenal of democracy no longer exists. And also, a lot of jobs are being offshored and outsourced overseas because overseas they don't have to, they meaning the employers, are not responsible for health care, and also they're not responsible for retirement plans. So basically, in essence, workers can be hired with slave wages to make a quality product. Here in Detroit, the literacy rate is currently at 34%, which is totally abysmal, and that makes it not attractive for employers to seek talent locally for jobs. So if you don't have a good public school system, then you won't have a first-class education. And then people won't be qualified to get jobs. Case in point, Amazon. Everyone's a champion for Amazon to come here. They said no. They said, no, we're not coming to Detroit because you don't have a good public transportation infrastructure, road infrastructure, but most importantly, residents are not qualified to be hired. So companies have to seek that you have educated population in order to hire people. Paradigm is shifting now where higher education is becoming a luxury. So basically, the precedence that's being set by this current presidential administration is setting a trajectory where people will have to pay for college out of pocket. And it wasn't intended to be a luxury for American citizens. We are seeing the decimation of Pell Grants and loans. I can attest that from my 14-year experiences teaching at Wayne County Community College District, 80% of the students at the institution are on some type of financial aid, but then there are some who need extra money coming in from their own income. So we are in a total crisis with respect to keeping people enrolled in four-year colleges and community colleges.
In the at the beginning, you talked about Reconstruction. You talked about education as one of the initiatives, and you talked about education for blacks. Was there an issue with education for whites at the same time?
The question was there an issue for education for whites during Reconstruction? It's kind of a yes or no answer. We had the Morrill Act, MORILL Act, which was created in the 1860s. That created a lot of state universities, like it created here at Michigan, it created your state ag schools like Michigan State, okay, it created Texas A&M, created Ohio State.
So this there's an addendum to that. In the South, before the Civil War, there were not a lot of public schools, so there were not public schools largely for whites either. And it was primarily through the black state legislators that were elected during Reconstruction that the state college and university systems and public schools came into existence. So both blacks and whites benefited from the establishment of public education in the South that was spearheaded by the black state legislators elected during Reconstruction.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned Richmond, California, and during the 1940s. It was during that time when the U.S. government and one of its agencies, the Federal Housing Agency, FHA, was basically saying to developers, okay, go ahead and build housing for whites, but we don't want any color to live over here.
Yes.
And it ended up where that became a major problem. Also, during that same time, the bank loans were given to whites. However, the bank loans were not given to colored at that time. And if whites lived in the same neighborhoods as colored during that time, they were not given bank loans.
Sure.
But once again, that was the Federal Housing Agency, the FHA, that was responsible for that. And if you care to know more about that, and I'm glad that Mr. Boykin brought this forward today about Richmond, there's a great book right now which is entitled The Color of Law. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Richard Rothstein. The book was actually presented last year.
Born in 48, but late 50s and early in 67, that's when I graduated from high school. They were integrated schools. We had to wait for the books from the white school to come over to the black high school. We had segregated offices, water offices, all of that stuff still going in 1967. We had a colored waiting room. We had fans. White waiting room, you had air conditioning. But when the air conditioning, it's always cool. And it's so bad, mom had to take us little kids. I'll never forget it. We have to walk through the white waiting room to get to the doctor. While they cool and have water to drink. We didn't have it. So, in the 60s, this stuff is still going on. I lived through it. And we played with each other, white and black. Our father worked for the judge, or my mother was a housekeeper. And it was amazing when we all graduated in 67, my friends who were my age from the white high school, no one was drafted. Our whole class got drafted to Vietnam in 1967. All of our friends who were white, so no one, they went on to serve, not to the army, but they went on and got jobs in the factory and plant. But no one went to Vietnam. We were.
Yeah.
We had to go. I think this was an outstanding presentation, and I'm very proud of you. And I'm going to give a passion. We will try to give other passions because the youth need to hear this.
Yes, they do.
The youth need to hear this. And we have a large enough, we have a national church, and hopefully we can use Bethel, and we can have full up the fellowship hall because they need this vital information.
Yes, I agree. Thank you.